Welcome to the History with Jackson podcast, and today we are talking with Dr Andrew W.M Smith. So, hi Andrew, how are you doing?
Hi Jackson, very well, thank you.
Good, I'm glad to have you on this podcast, and thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, firstly, what do you do as a historian?
So I work at the University of Chichester, and I'm a senior lecturer in contemporary history and politics. Most of the time I work on the French and Francophone world, and a lot on French history. I'm really interested in ideas of, I guess you could say, resistance, understood quite broadly, about the way that people face up to the structures around them, how they define themselves in relationship to the state. And that's led me down a lot of interesting paths to look at, Second World War resistance, to look at the end of French Empire, to look at the region and the state as well. So trying to find different ways that people are able to kind of understand the world around them and their relationship to structures of power.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some real key themes that have come through in all your teaching that we've had for the past 3 years, and I find them quite interesting as well. But how did this become your area of expertise?
Well, it's one of the interesting things. I never knew that I wanted to study French history. I did obviously history as an undergrad when I went to university, but I hadn't done French language at the equivalent of A-level at Advanced Higher in Scotland. I did Higher French, which would be about an AS level or a GCSE type thing. But I never took it any further. And one of the things I found is just when I was studying at a university, it was just one of these things that the more of the modules I took, the more of the lectures I worked with, I just seemed to find the French stuff most compelling. But also my laziness came into play as well, because one of the difficulties I had is that I worked a lot when I was at university. I had a lot of different jobs on the go at the same time, and I found that I often kept quite irregular hours, shall we say. So when I used to try and go get reading from the library, I used to go and find that almost everything was gone and out, the stuff I wanted to look at, except for the stuff in French. So I had to kind of try and reteach myself French a bit from that kind of higher French, just to try and get back into it, so that I could essentially still have some reading to use for my essays. But that was really the way into it in terms of studying French. And then I wrote my dissertation, my undergraduate dissertation. I wrote on French history. I decided to write it about wine. I had a chat with a guy who's still teaches up at St Andrews, who's a very good friend, a guy called Stephen Tyre. I spoke to him and I said, look, I want to do something on French history. And he said, okay, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I like wine. And I did, I'd actually done a qualification in wine when I was at high school in the summer holidays. My dad was a salesman. He worked in a lot of different things. He worked for Rothmans, and he worked Scottish Newcastle Brewers, but eventually became a wine merchant. And I did it through his work, this certificate in wines and spirits. And so I had probably a kind of advanced and educated palate, but one that I probably couldn't afford to satisfy as a student, and probably still can't. But I decided that I'd like to do something about wine, to put that knowledge to use. So I tried to find places to look for how to engage with wine and French history. And Stephen Tyre's advice was, well, what kind of things could you look at? He said, well, let's have a start. He said, what's your favourite wine? What's your go-to bottle? And my favourite wine has always been Fitu. That's the appellation that I tend to go towards. Now, Fitu is a kind of rustic red from the south of France, from the Languedoc. It's produced in the Aude. And I got really interested in that region and just looking at the kind of, the kind of possibilities in the background to what was going on in that region and the way that the wine was produced. And yeah, I've just become fascinated by it ever since. And of course, that's then what I wrote that dissertation on. It's then what I went on and did a PhD on, and what I wrote my first book on, was the wine growers of the Languedoc, and some of the ways in which they faced up to kind of big changes in the French economy and the global economy as well.
That actually sounds really interesting. I didn't know that you'd learned French through basically having no sources left in the library. I think that's quite funny, actually. And I've noticed the first book, you wrote a book on wine earlier before your academic piece. I found that quite cool as well.
Yeah, that was a funny one. I basically, when I was doing the PhD, my wife was working for a small publishing company, and they produced like gift books and all these kind of things. And they tried to, they were putting together a series they called Pocket Bibles. One of my friends actually wrote the football Pocket Bible, and I had some other friends wrote kind of things as well. But they needed someone to write the wine Pocket Bible. And so it didn't pay very well, but it was one of these things I thought was a useful experience to try and kind of put some of those ideas down. But it was a fun thing to do, a little kind of gift book that I produced, which is certainly not academic. But yeah.
So today I've asked you to come on to the podcast to talk about your paper, Je suis socialiste et quinze, Rugby, Wine and Socialism in the Aude since 1976. So firstly, what and where is the Aude?
Sure, yeah. Well, so in France, the country's divided up into departments, départements. Departments are a bit like in a British context, we would understand councils, you know. So a department would be the equivalent of West Sussex, for example. And the Aude is a department of France. In terms of where it is in France, it's right down south on the coast, towards the border with Spain, near the Pyrenees. And it's part of what we tend to call the Languedoc. Recently, not super interesting, but there was a reorganisation of French regions, and it's now part of the region of Occitanie. And this kind of links back to the idea of its regional identity. So it's right down there in the south of France. It's a very sunny place. In terms of its economy, it's been dominated by wine for quite a long time. It's a beautiful place. I'd very much recommend a visit. There'll be places like Carcassonne. Is a very famous town, of course, a very famous rugby town as well. But people will have seen pictures of Carcassonne, of course, because it has its cité médiévale, the kind of medieval walled city, which was rebuilt in the 19th century by Viollet-le-Duc, and it's an absolutely beautiful, picturesque place that's definitely worth a look, worth a visit at some point.
Okay, and what are the differences between the south and north? Because the way I've kind of seen it is the south is like the north of England, and the north of France is more like the south of England. Would I be right in saying something like that?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because you get these kind of very, very regional differences, and you're absolutely right. There is a very strong kind of like north-south divide. I think especially in France, the centre, as in Paris, is always understood as a kind of a magnet, you know, that kind of sucks all the development and all the culture and all the activity towards its centre. That's something that comes out of the French Revolution, the idea of Jacobin centralism, of controlling the state from the centre. It's something which has long been a characteristic of the French state. There's a book comes out in 1947 by a geographer called Jean-François Gravier, and he calls it Paris and the French Desert. And there's this kind of criticism that the rest of the country is like a desert, while Paris is the oasis in the centre that draws everyone towards it. So very much there's a kind of regional divide between Paris as a centre of development and the south as being kind of somewhere that's very different. But you're right. There's a kind of, the south is often associated with maybe a more peasant identity. It's often associated with being a more kind of rustic place. They're often kind of, at the moment, the current Prime Minister of France, Jean Castex, is from the south, who has a very distinctive southern accent. A lot of the time, people will talk about, like in Britain, people remark on regional accents. The southern French accent can be quite distinctive, a little bit more kind of verre de vin blanc, a little bit tang tang tang. Yeah, it's I think you're not far off with that kind of comparison. A bit like a kind of inversion of that that British idea, the cultured, wealthy, kind of sophisticated South, perhaps, against an earthier, more rustic, more kind of down to earth South, perhaps in France.
Yeah, and like that, the kind of industry in that area. Obviously, it's wine, and there's a lot of a lot of listeners will know. There's a lot of famous wines coming from this region. But how important was this wine industry to the region? Because obviously, there's a lot of wines coming from the south of France.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, and I've always found it quite a bit of a challenge sometimes when I'm talking to people about what I study, because when you start talking about wine, and this is one of the interesting things, wine tends to be surrounded by a discourse of luxury, of refined things and moustache twirling and all the rest of it. But down in the south, wine is produced not really as a star of the dinner table, but a staple, and the industry is vastly important, has been vastly important throughout the 20th century. I often talk about it when I'm describing it to people, and I think here your point you made about the north and the south and the British comparison is probably valid, because when I'm talking about it, I always describe, wine in the Languedoc, certainly the early 20th century, as being like shipbuilding in Glasgow or Newcastle. To the extent that it's just, it's absolutely central to the health of the area. And so when you do see difficulties for the industry, and there are systemic and structural difficulties that emerge throughout the 20th century, that really affects the whole region, from those directly involved, but also kind of, auxiliary industries, early in the 20th century, even things like barrel making and transport and all that kind of stuff. It's a really crucial industry at the time.
And then in the paper you link wine with rugby. Now obviously in the UK we've got this intrinsic link between rugby and beer, but obviously in France there's a different drinking culture. So how were they linked, and what challenges were both of these areas facing?
Yeah, well, I think, I tend to link ideas of I think that regional divide is really important. Again, when you talk about rugby, we tend to talk about, in that paper I talked about the chic de Paris contre le choc du midi, the Parisian chic kind of cool rugby, as it were, a very refined gentleman and all the rest of it, versus the South, which was, to put it in a very simplistic way, big bloatery peasants just knocking seven sides or whatever out of each other, and that kind of divide really emerges from the way that rugby's introduced to France. In the kind of end of the 19th century, when rugby becomes big in Paris, it's very much this kind of, Corinthian ideal. It's all kind of very well-to-do, young university students who are talking about manners and rules and all the rest. In the South, it kind of comes in often through wine merchants, wine imports, and you see the influence of, for example, Scottish wine merchants in Bordeaux, introducing things like rugby as a kind of as an interest, and really it spreads throughout the villages of the south of France, largely following the path of wine, So certainly it does have a whiff of wine corks about it when you're actually describing it. So rather than it being about the rugby school in Warwickshire and William Webb Ellis and all the rest of it, there is in France a desire to look, first of all, at regional games that contribute to it, but really also this introduction from about 1890 as it spread out from Bordeaux, Toulouse and Lyon in the south. And that takes it away from being that kind of individual kind of, I guess you'd say individual kind of backs game, if you know what I mean, a wingers game, which is what you imagine it being in Paris of the day, towards being more, again, speak very loosely, more of a forwards game. This when it moves to the south, it is much more about kind of heavy rolling rucks and mauls, and about the idea of kind of a forwards game, as it were, an earthier peasant game. And that's really where, so first of all, wine is important because it's one of the vehicles by which rugby is, I guess, transmitted into France. But then also it's it's part of the kind of the culture. You always think about if you think back to Asterix, if you remember at the end of every Asterix strip, every Asterix book, they've got the bit where they all meet round the campfire. They've got the bard usually tied up, but they're all feasting on wild boar and having this big kind of knees up as a village. That's often the theme in terms of French rugby, the idea of the kind of the third half, the troisième mi-temps, when you essentially all get back together after knocking seven shades out of each other for a big knees up celebration at the end. So it's a kind of part of a convivial culture. It's part of something which is rooted in the area. It kind of spreads through the idea of wine country. It suits kind of peasant bodies, if you will. It becomes tied to this concept of masculinity, I think, especially in the South. Rugby is a very masculine sport, and I think when you have big hulking guys that work in the fields, that often suits this style of rugby in the South as it develops throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, I think you definitely see that across England as well, where you go to certain areas. I've particularly played rugby in some farmer areas, and you get a very different style of rugby to what you get down here in Chichester. So I can definitely see how those links of regional identity play into it. Rugby is such a popular game. Why did it gain this popularity over, say, other sports in this region? And then what did it start to mean to these people? Because obviously it's very important in the way that you experience your life and you create bonds. So yeah, why did it gain this popularity over other things like football and so on?
Well, I think it does have a really important regional success. It enjoys regional success because it is, again, like you mentioned, such a convivial game. It becomes something that the community can get behind. It fits the idea of villages, of kind of village clubs, village teams. It fits the idea of ideas of how it relates to like the defense of territory. The idea of the kind of défense du clocher, the defense of the clock tower. In French culture, the idea of the clocher, the kind of village town hall, the kind of church spire, the church bell, is a bit like in London people talk about the Cockneys and being born within the thing where you can hear the bells. There's a sense of kind of emotional attachment to the church bells of your home village, and this idea that it connects to a sense of place. And I think that's one of the reasons we start to see this kind of concept coming together. It's also because I think people are good at it. There is a kind of real success in the South throughout the early 20th century. First of all, it's popular, but then also they see a lot of success both within France and internationally. And I think that really drives its popularity because people like successful sports. They like successful sports teams. It draws people into the game when club teams are successful, but also when the international team is successful. And so the idea, the way in which France has been tied into international rugby for so long is another example of things that draw people towards the game, I think.
And then so a lot of these players were wine growers and so on. The terms of like what did wine mean to these rugby players in the south of France, was it just then it was a huge part of their identity, but it was something that set them apart from the rest of the country? We play rugby, but our wine is who we are, and our wine growing and our methods is what we do and how we see ourselves, really.
Yeah, so I found one of the reasons I essentially wrote the paper was that I found whenever I was looking into people in the South, it was like there was this kind of like holy trinity, for somebody to make it in the region, to be successful as a kind of, a politician or anything like that. There were always these kind of three touchstones they needed to have, and that was where the title came from. You had guys, politicians, saying like, "Je suis quinziste et socialiste." Quinziste, quinze being rugby union, 13 being rugby league. But the idea was that people in the South, seemingly to be a significant person, in terms of politics, you had to be you had to earn your chops to do with rugby, you had to earn your chops to do with wine, and you also had to earn your chops to do with left politics as well. And there was seemingly this kind of trinity, where all the big people I was looking at were kind of constantly making reference to the fact that, they were quinziste, socialiste, and of course tied into wine growing unions as well, which was the context I was looking at them in. So I think there's certainly something about it's used as a kind of formation. In the paper as well, I use an example of how it kind of supports a kind of an image of masculinity, because you have these newspaper articles. These are from the 1970s, mind, but it showed a bunch of babies, and these were kind of kids who grew up to be international rugby players from the South. And it goes on about the fact, it says they weren't raised on mineral water. These are kind of sons of wine growers. They were raised on wine, all the rest of this kind of stuff, So it kind of ties into this image of what it's going for. I think it's important to note as well, though, that there are kind of downsides to that kind of hyper-masculine identity in the South, and especially to do with rugby. And one of them is it's the reason that France is banned from international rugby for a while, because of the level of violence in the rugby of the South. Around about the kind of like mid to late 20s into 1930, and it's after the then Five Nations in 1931. Sorry, I nearly said Six Nations out of habit. But after the Five Nations in 1931, that it's that France is banned from international rugby for a number of years. And that's really because of the level of violence that's largely developed around Southern rugby in the 1920s. Why? Because of, again, this choc du midi, the idea of powerful, hard-hitting rugby. And that relates to fan violence, and I'm sure there's a fair bit of wine involved in that fan violence, but also kind of violence on the field, really uncompromising, heavy-hitting rugby that's understood as being about real kind of... like hard-hitting rugby at that stage. And the bans come in 1931. Part of it's to do with violence. And of course, there's a very strong representation of the Southern players in the national team. People like Jean Galliat become really important. But then also... it's to do with amateurism as well. And that's one of the big things. Because it's successful, because of all these things I'm talking about with the kind of crossover between politics and business and all the rest of it. A lot of the club teams are kind of starting to try and pay players. They're starting to get, it's big business. It draws crowds. There's a lot of money behind it. And at the time, rugby is an amateur game. It values its amateurism very highly. And that's one of the reasons that France gets banned. First of all, for the violence. And second of all, because there are all these investigations into amateurism in the sport. And there's a real worry that French rugby is kind of going in a kind of funny way in terms of the development of kind of sham amateurism or kind of like hidden professionalism as well. There's a lot of crossover at that stage. So, like I say, there's specific styles of rugby there, and that can be really positive, really kind of vibrant. But it can also be something that has its downsides as well, I think.
Yeah, well, you mentioned a really couple of interesting points there that I definitely want to zoom in on a little bit more. So, firstly, you mentioned rugby league. Now, obviously, we don't look at France as a rugby league power now. I think there's only Catalan Dragons now who are based in the south of France. So, what role did rugby league play in all of this? And then you look at the sham amateurism, and that's kind of the hit of globalization, really. So, what kind of effect was globalization starting to make on rugby in France in this period? Because obviously rugby's really valued, like you said, it's really valued its amateurism, and it only really went professional in the 90s. So what kind of effects were both of these having?
Yeah, I mean, so I think I mentioned that guy there, Jean Galliat, who's I followed in that paper talking about the team Quilon. And Jean Galliat is a big player for Quilon. He's a second row, and he's a good example. He's an outstanding international level rugby player, who's part of this kind of like southern, powerhouse. But then the difficulty is once France is banned on the international scene, that pushes a lot of those 15 players, the union players, into rugby league. And rugby league is seen at the time as being something which is, a really a big growth industry. And somebody like Jean Galliard becomes a huge advocate for 13, for rugby league from 1934. And so at the time, 13 rugby league is a very, very influential competitor to rugby union. France is readmitted into the international order in 1939, but of course there aren't many games played after 1939 because, the Second World War and all sorts. But that does actually affect how rugby is played in France, because there is this kind of political intervention. The idea is that in the run-up to the start of the Second World War, from a purely sporting sense, rugby union has been on the decline because of that international ban, because of the flight of some of the key players to 13, because 13 is a faster game, it's all the rest of it, and it really, really boomed in France, rugby league, in the run-up to the Second World War. But of course, as we know, during the Second World War, France falls in 1940, defeated by the Germans, and you've got the kind of the occupied zone in the north, and then the notional free zone, with the collaborationist government run by Vichy in the south. Now the weird thing is that in the south, the Vichy government actually goes and addresses itself to sport. It's one of the key ways they can try and bring in this focus on what the shape of the nation will be. They're not involved in the war anymore, they're in armed neutrality, but they think they can kind of define themselves in the sport field. And that's one of the odd things that happen. They set up this, the Vichy government sets up this commission. It's run by a guy called Jean Barotre, who's a tennis player. He won Wimbledon, I think in 1924. But he brings a bunch of people on board, people like Jep Pasco, who's a rugby union player from Perpignan. You mentioned Catalan Dragons, of course, based in Perpignan as well. And people like Jean Ibarnagaré as well. And they start this kind of like investigation into what's going on in rugby. In terms of how it's been, what's been going on with it. And essentially they produce all these different reports, and in October 1940, not long after the fall of France, this report is released into sport. And one of the things they say is that, 13, rugby league, has got to go. They say effectively that it's a job, it's not a game, that there shouldn't be disunity in France's sport fields. But the idea is also that, rugby is tied to the land. It's a form of, the guy, Paul Voivenel, who's the guy that writes the report, he says, it's a form of patriotism. He says to understand one's village is to understand France. They talk about all this kind of stuff. And so they ban rugby league. Jean Ibarnagaré comes out and he essentially says, look, rugby league is banned. He said it will be quite simply deleted from French sport. They legally ban rugby league. But then, moreover, what they then do is they take all the assets of clubs and organisations for rugby league and they give them to rugby union clubs. So it's, they literally take stadia, they take clubhouses, they take all these things and they are kind of redistributed in that way. So there's a kind of huge ideological attack against 13, against rugby league, which takes place, and that it's fascinating to see that you've got this like really kind of political intervention in sport at this time, and of course that then favours rugby union and kind of really uproots rugby league so that it doesn't have that same basis for rebuilding after the war. So absolutely, 13 rugby league is really, really influential, a huge competitor for union in the 1930s. However, it is uprooted during the Second World War, literally uprooted, so that its stadia are redistributed to union players for political reasons, and that leads to this massive predominance of rugby union after the war as well, and that really sets the tone for France to be dominated by union in the years that follow, because it's the one that has the institutions, it's the one that has the support, the infrastructure, and all the rest of it. So there's a lot, I think, there of important reasons that rugby union becomes predominant in quite that same way. You don't see quite the same focus on 13 in France at this time, for sure, yeah.
And then the region kind of takes a a step leftwards politically as well. So why was socialism particularly kind of intrinsically linked to the region?
Yeah, sure. So immediately after the Second World War, there's a lot of kind of left politics in France. You know, one of the reasons that General de Gaulle steps back from power is because of the inclusion of like the Communist Party, for example, in parliamentary politics. And the South, because of its heavy focus on wine growing, its heavy focus on wine growing cooperatives. You know, essentially people kind of form these cooperative businesses, and there's a massive explosion in them, and the number of those in the post-war period. They become a vehicle for trying to kind of rebuild France's agriculture, and so you've got a lot of emphasis on some of these institutions, I think you would say, of the South, of what's actually going to be you get this model that people start to call député du vin. So in France, the député is the equivalent of an MP. The French Parliament is called the National Assembly. And so, for example, somebody like Raoul Calas. Raoul Calas is often a guy who is associated very strongly with this model of being a wine deputy. Another person called Bayeux is another kind of good example. But Calas, if we talk about him for a second, he's a really good example. Now, Calas is somebody that very strongly represents the wine growers, very strongly represents the South, and really talks about the heritage of the South as well. One of the things I talk about a lot in my book is a huge uprising that takes place in 1907 down in the South, the Grand Revolt, where you get this huge uprising by wine growers protesting against what they see as fraud and kind of like financial manipulation of the markets and stuff, and due to a lack of regulation, and they blame kind of external forces and try and campaign for greater regulation, greater intervention, and all the rest of it. Now, after the war, as I said, you get a big focus on the left, and somebody like Calas is really kind of a good example of that, because Calas is a figure who he does something pretty wild. In 1947 in France, nationally, there's a big wave of strikes. There's a general strike after the war, by a lot of trade unions working together, pushing for paying conditions and all the rest of it. Now, Calas sees this as a moment to try and re-invoke the memory of 1907, that regional memory. And one of the big things that happens in 1907 is that a regiment of soldiers defects to the side of the protesters, the 17th Regiment. There's there's a famous song about it which develops in the region, Gloire au 17e, glory to the 17th. And basically that's, a kind of regional southern drinking song. It's the kind of thing you'd hear people singing. It's very strongly about the South. It's very strongly about resistance. It's about, pride, and it's about difference and all the rest. Now, what happens is Calas in the National Assembly, in Parliament, he takes to the Speaker's rostrum, the Speaker's platform, and just starts singing Gloire au 17e, and occupies the Speaker's thing, trying to call on soldiers to join the strikers. And he is expelled from Parliament by soldiers, by the police, because he's seen as being he's accused of trying to, foment revolution or something from the actual platform. And that kind of interesting kind of sense of how you see this southern identity, this leftist identity, playing on the long heritage of resistance in the region is absolutely tied into the wine industry. So it's, as I said at the start, people draw their legitimacy from these kind of legitimating factors: wine, rugby, socialism. You then see those people carry out things which make use of their own identity, and they talk about the importance of that regional identity to their contemporary operations. And echoes of that in moments like 1947 confirm the importance of the left to the South. And that's something that continues after the war for a long time, and really up until the 1980s, I would say.
That was really that whole area, relations to politics and socialism, I find quite interesting because in the UK, like these farm types tend to lean to the right sometimes, especially with the National Farmers Union. So you mentioned some organisations that protect the workers and the wine growers. What were these organisations? You mentioned a few in your paper, and do they take any like illegal action to protect their own interests?
Yeah, absolutely. So, certainly in the first instance, there is a very strong kind of syndical scene. Syndical, essentially I'm talking about trade unions in France. And there's a lot of trade unions specifically relating to wine. Now, I won't go over all the, the specific machinations of the different unions and all the rest of it. It's all in the book if you're interested. But basically, there are a series of changes to wine growers and wine labourers trade unions representing the broader sector throughout the 1950s. And they're all kind of constantly trying to really outflank each other to the left. Now, one of the things that changes is you've got all these various trade unions, basically, syndical organisations, which are representing wine growers throughout the post-war period. What changes really is the Algerian War, which, the Algerian War is a big conflict of decolonisation in France. It's a huge political, social, cultural shift. It's France still has conscription at the time. It's basically 1954 to 1962. At the time, Algeria is technically part of France, territorially part of France, but effectively a colony of France. It during a kind of war of anti-colonialism, an anti-imperial conflict led by the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, the Algerian Liberation Movement, who pushed back against French rule. Now, anyway, it's a very bloody, very awful war. But one of the big things, as I mentioned, conscription. But 1 in 4 families send a son to Algeria during that time from France. And that's a really, it's transformative. And it changes things in the south as well, because a lot of young guys go and do their 30 mois, their 30 months kind of service, effectively military service, in Algeria in this quite dreadful conflict, and then come back to the same difficulties, the same kind of sales crises, the same structural problems, the same XYZ that people have been talking about for a long, long time. And that really shakes up the trade union scene. And really from about 1961, towards the end of the Algerian War, you have a series of young veterans, effectively, who've been out and done their tour of duty in Algeria, come back to the same villages they left, and they're in the same state they left, and they look back at the people that were fighting in Algeria and say sometimes like, actually, do you know what? I identify maybe more with them than the guys up in Paris. And you get people at the time talking about these wine radicals start talking about they want to fight back. They say like the Felaha, like the rebels in Algeria, like the fighters there, and they want to push back against the kind of against Paris. And so really you get the development of this organisation. This is who my book's all about, the Comité Régional d'Action Viticole, the CRAV, the Regional Wine Action Committee, that means. And basically you might see them basically as being the kind of armed wing of the trade union movement. It's not an official organisation. It's the idea of a kind of something that's kind of drawn up and formed at times of crisis. So it has a kind of episodic existence where it kind of is, formed up by groups of people. And it's the kind of thing where you get people, spokespeople for the CRAV constantly talk about the fact that they intervene when the situation is blocked. And so you get these guys essentially taking kind of direct action, often what they call commando action or guerrilla action, against symbols of the state. And so often these groups, these cravistes, as we tend to call them, people that belong to the CRAV, would be involved in, for example, protests, which could involve kind of like, one of the things they do is they intercept tankers of wine. So on the motorways, they would run controls and intercept like tanker lorries. At ports like Sète, they might intercept tanker ships, and they would either then disgorge the wine in those tankers, or kind of damage or pollute it, or in some way. They form burning barricades on train lines. They've bombed offices of political parties, things like electricity substations. They've targeted wine merchants and blenders as well. I mean, merchants not in the sense of the British sense of a shop, if you know what I mean, but like people that kind of blend and package wine and release it under different labels. So they've been quite an active force, and they're a force that has been, as I said, episodic in nature, but certainly still an active force for quite a long time. That starts about 61, and it's really still going today. You can see kind of more recent action as well. So there are kind of there's legitimate forces to represent wine growers, but there's also kind of illegitimate forces as well, who try and kind of intervene when that situation's blocked, and try and kind of change the tenor of that conversation to draw greater intervention on that front. And the interesting thing is, a lot of those guys, a lot of those spokesmen for the Crave, are themselves, former rugby players, are people with backgrounds and all the rest of it in rugby. People like Aude, who's one of the kind of key figures as well, one of those kind of young veterans that comes back. He himself is I think he's a fly half, but he's, you get all these different guys come back, and they've all got those, like I said, those kind of legitimating factors of the South. They're all quinziste, they're all socialiste, and they're all kind of tied into to wine growing as well, whether they're vignerons or they're actually, just what part of that wider scene. So it all flows together in the South in that way. I think it's a really interesting combination of those things.
Yeah, and obviously these movements are reactionary to changes in the area. In your paper, you have this really nice graph or chart, really, which looks at the changing nature of wine grower or wine plot ownership. Would that be like an effect of globalization or the economy in the area?
Yeah, so there's a number of reasons that things change. Essentially, for a long time, the kind of the fundamental reality of wine in the South is that too much basic wine is being produced. Too much basic drinking wine is being produced. More than can be sold effectively. And as France continues to open up to the world through European integration, through things like global trade and all the rest of it, it starts to import other wines as well. It starts to be involved in things like the Common Agricultural Policy, which brings wine into its purview. Kind of in the 1980s as well, like when you start to see many more controls around what's happening in this, and it's kind of part of France's opening up, which is part of the issue. That's one of the demands that you see Cravistes make. They say, well, we produce this much wine. If it's not selling, then we should stop all imports. And that's the kind of demand, which in some ways is kind of common sense, I guess, but it's also functionally impossible for the state to kind of pull out of all its international obligations for the favour of a regional industry. And that's the kind of the tragedy of it in some ways. So there are, I think, it is a function of opening up to the world. It is a function of engaging in global markets. It is a function of changing tastes, changing kind of structures of wine. There's been some fantastic stuff. There was a really good book written just recently by a guy called Joseph Bowling, called The Sober Revolution, which is a fascinating look at kind of anti-alcoholism campaigns in France and abstinence campaigns in France, and about how this kind of focus, there's a lot of pressures on French wine growers throughout the post-war period to produce less wine and produce better wine. And that's very much the focus throughout this kind of structural transformation. Now, that doesn't necessarily work well for the kind of productivist sector of the Languedoc. There are lots of people there who work in the kind of a kind of quasi agro industry type kind of sector, that actually it becomes quite challenging in that sense for that transition to happen. And I mentioned things like the transformation of wine holding, transformation of land holding, excuse me, sorry, that some of that comes from organisations like the SAFER, which are to do with like land holding and about kind of different types of land tenure and what happens when land is sold to try and retain it within local communities. Some of that is to do with uprooting programmes, and there are kind of a huge ramping up of uprooting programmes from the mid-1980s, and that's really tied with ideas of European integration. Now, what I mean by uprooting programmes is essentially there are funds made available, prime d'arrachage définitif, the PAD, excuse me, which is about essentially paying people to arracher, to tear up their vines, to grub them up definitively, and you essentially pay them a lump sum to do that, because that reduces the production, the volume of wine that France is producing, which better helps stabilise the market for others. But of course, when you're talking about a rooted, like literally rooted regional industry, rooted with the vines, and then you are uprooting it, it's not just an economic transaction that's taking place. It's a structural transformation, but it's also a shift in identity. And there's a big issue, I think, around kind of people pushing back against the impact on people's identity as, the economic activity of that region changes. And a real sense for many people that they are being sidelined or kind of cut out of a type of development, that there's a type of modernization which people come to associate with trends of globalization, with trends of kind of neoliberalism and kind of ideas like that people see as being kind of profoundly negative. And that's, I think, how you would tie it into it. So there are kind of specific ways in which it ties into the opening up of the French economy and markets, but also I think kind of political identity issues as well.
Yeah. I find that area really quite interesting. It's been quite a distinct region within France for hundreds of years, and you talk a lot about identity for the South, which is quite important for them. And obviously, I've done a video on the Albigensian Crusade. And they start.
Sure.
You've mentioned in your paper that they start using the symbolism from the past. So the symbols of the Cathars, previous Albigensian symbols, and you mention a rise in Occitanie or Languedoc nationalism. So, like that nationalism, how does that come out politically within this period?
Yeah, I mean, so Occitanism is focused around, obviously, the Languedoc in terms of its area. It's specifically focused on the use of the Occitan language, which is very widespread at the start of the 20th century, becomes less so as centralised schooling and all the rest of it lead more young people not to learn Occitan and so on. And you're right, yeah, the symbols of that past are kind of constantly thrown up. So I mentioned 1907 before, the guys that lead that, Ernest Ferroul and Marcelin Albert, those kind of the leaders of that 1907 revolt, they speak in Carcassonne beneath the kind of Cité médiévale, the walled city, and they all talk about the Albigensian Crusade. They talk about the idea, that like those guys, they're standing there resisting the barons of the north. But the difficulty you have is, what they talk about is the, in the Albigensian Crusade, the barons were literal barons. Yeah. But they talk about, in 1907, they're talking about barons of industry. And that's the same kind of idea. They talk about the same kind of division, essentially, as being kind of tied to those things. And you see it, throughout this period. There's a big relaunch, I think, of Occitanism as a political project, which happens in the 1960s. there's a lot more kind of sociologists, there's a lot more kind of intellectuals who engage with it, and it starts getting tied to kind of new left issues especially. So it gets kind of revitalised, I think, in the 1960s, and tied to kind of quite important causes like the wine growers, things like the Larzac movement, minor strikes like Decazeville in 1962, or you can name a lot of different struggles, but there's a kind of a sense that it's revitalised as a political movement at that stage, and that kind of fits into a kind of a resistant kind of identity, really. There is a bit of kind of Occitan politics, and there's kind of there's some kind of autonomist movements. The difficulty you have with Occitanism as a political movement is that it doesn't have a defined territory in the same way that some other places have, because Occitanie was never an actual political unit. You might class it as being kind of roughly analogous to the lands of the Counts of Toulouse, or you might see it as being everywhere that Occitan was spoken. There are difficulties in terms of having an autonomous movement which calls for half of France to be given a separate political identity. There's a kind of, I think most people would see in that a kind of a problem of realism, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
The French state's not going to say, right, fine, you have the lower half. But I think there are kind of campaigns certainly for a lot more decentralisation, a lot more allowances to be made for the protection of regional culture, for the protection of minority languages within France's culture, and that's been a real sticking point, I think, in contrast to, as we mentioned before, that kind of centralising character of the French state. So Occitanism has been, especially in the post-war period, a kind of function of broadly leftist politics, but it has kind of travelled. And it's certainly an interesting vehicle through which a lot of people have expressed resistance to the central state, I think.
Yeah, and then just heading back to rugby and its regional connections. Obviously, you see globalization hit post 1995, and the kind of professionalization of the game in France, particularly the South as well. Has the South, how has it adapted to this period with the influx of foreign players, and are there still those regional connections between people and their clubs? Because obviously you have Toulon building that Galactico style rugby, you have Toulouse dominating French rugby for large periods of time, but these teams have foreign players. I think at one point I could name more South African and Australian and English players in the Toulon team than I could French. So how's that adapted?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you're right, that obviously changes ideas of how teams represent that kind of rooted nature, how they represent that kind of sense that they are, it's the défense du clocher, and all that kind of stuff. And I think, you're absolutely right. You can't necessarily say in the same way that it tends to represent the same local lads defending the village and all the rest of it. But that's something that's been going on really since, well, I mean, you talk about ideas of globalization, of course, like all this other stuff, it's the kind of 87 World Cup, isn't it, that really marks that kind of moment after which rugby is, basically a professional sport, and understood as being such, and it becomes much more global after that stage as well. I think it does still have a really important influence, really, on people, and people do take on the kind of the atmosphere of it. Obviously, Carcassonne aren't really a kind of top level team, you might not say, No. But you look at their kind of fans groups called the Les Hérétiques, with a reference back to the idea of the Albigensian Crusade. But there are all sorts of kind of international players who've gone on to play in the South, and really taken on an image of of what it means to be in the South. There are all kinds of, like you had Kiwi players when they first came across, and South African players when they first came across, who kind of took on something of this, what would you say, this kind of culture, really, of the South, and this culture of Southern rugby, this idea of what's represented by the rugby de village, this kind of Languedocian, Languedocian rugby, as it were. I think I mentioned somewhere in the article as well. I think it's Kees van der Merwe, who talks about the idea that he becomes this kind of champion of a different type of rugby, a different sense of rugby, and starts to represent it really on that basis. I think the idea, the quite intense fan cultures, the kind of the key support for all of these things, is something really that sweeps people along with it. I mentioned as well, one of the things I quote in the article is the guy John Daniel, who played for Montpellier. There's a quote from him in there, from his autobiography, which he really talks about this idea of taking on that culture. I can read you the quote just now, because it gives you a kind of a good sense of it, I think, which addresses exactly what you're saying, like this sense of players going there and getting it, and I think there's a real sense of that when players connect with the fans in French rugby, it doesn't matter where they're from that place, So John Daniel talks about it in his autobiography. He says, and I quote, I've already mentioned I won't do the accent, I've already mentioned the French idea of l'esprit de clocher, the credo of collective duty to the town, the team and the jersey. The peculiarity of the French version of pride in the jersey is that it manifests itself much more strongly when you play at home. At home, the team is like the local militia, entrusted with the sacred duty of repelling the invaders and upholding the honour of the town, and everyone is watching. The highly developed sense of geographical awareness is linked to another very French idea, that of terroir, the notion that a product draws its identity from the soil in which it's produced, and its character from the culture that surrounds it. So that idea there, for somebody like John Daniel, a kind of Kiwi player who's coming to play in Montpellier, it draws on a language of wine to kind of talk about how it takes on the culture of its production. It takes on this idea of representing the fans and representing the local area. And you see that develop right across rugby, I think, from this sense that, it's something which has a kind of strong fan culture around it. It has its own kind of traditions. It has its own kind of regional traditions as well. And this idea of really kind of stonking Southern rugby is one that is, continues to be important and continues to win people round to it as well, as you can see in that description by John Daniel.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dave. I've really enjoyed learning more about this outside of your article as well, Andrew.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, and then where can our listeners find you and keep up to date with you?
Well, as you know, I'm a teacher at the University of Chichester. I've got a Twitter account where you can find out more stuff that I'm doing, and a blog as well. My Twitter account is @smidbob, and my website is awmsmith.com. Oh no, sorry, it's andrewwmsmith.com. I always include my initials just because there's 1,000 Andrew Smiths in the world. But I've got a blog on there as well where I sometimes put up things about often the material I come across when I'm teaching, and kind of things that I've been working on as well. So yeah, you can find me on Twitter, or you can find some blog posts that I've written, some of which are about ideas of rugby as well. I think I wrote something about the first Rugby International as well, and connections to it. But yeah.
And in true History of Jackson fashion, I tend to recommend books for our readers if they want to learn more on the subject. So what would you recommend if anyone wants to get stuck into this subject a bit more?
I'll be cheesy and say you can obviously read my book, which is it's called Terror and Terroir, the Wine Growers of the Languedoc in Modern France, and that's published by Manchester University Press, and it's out in paperback as well, so it's not just ludicrously expensive as some academic books are, but that's out there if you fancy a read about wine terrorism, in particular about French rugby. There's a book by Philip Dine called French Rugby Football, A Cultural History, and that is an absolutely outstanding book, I think, that is really, really interesting, and you'll find a lot of really useful stuff about within that. That I think is that's one of the key references if you wanted to find out more about rugby in France. Philip Downs' book is really excellent. What else would I recommend? There's some good stuff on. I'm trying to think of things in English as well. Sorry,
that's all right.
I mentioned Joseph Bowling's book, The Sober Revolution. I think that's a really interesting one about wine that's recently been written. Likewise, I recently reviewed a book by Venus Bivar, Bivar, called Organic Resistance, which is all about kind of the reforms to farming in France. And I'm also, I've just very, very recently, as in like just a couple of days ago, sent off a review of a very recent release by Sarah Farmer, which is called Rural Inventions, the French Countryside After 1945. And those kind of give you a good sense of the way and the field around the kind of transformation of the countryside, and about how we can understand the importance of the countryside to the French state, to French identity, but also understand some of its tensions as well and the rich political things we can find within that.
Yeah, and I know you've recently published Britain, France and the Decolonisation of Africa, Future Imperfect with Chris Jepson. I'd really recommend that book if anyone else wants to go and have a quick look at that one. I think it's on UCL Press, if I'm right.
Yeah, so that means it's free as well. That one's open access. So yeah, it's an edited volume that I wrote with a friend Chris that I used to teach with at UCL, and it kind of covers the end of empire. So it's kind of work of, it's really kind of imperial history, if you know what I mean. It's mostly looking at how the French state tries to kind of complicate and deal with some of those issues of the end of empire. But yeah, it was really a lot of fun to write. There's some interesting ideas in there. So yeah, certainly worth a read. I've written a couple of articles just in the last year as well. There's one on the 10th anniversary of D-Day in 1954 and all the kind of discussions around that. It's quite a fun story, that one, because it's essentially all about a commemoration that goes wrong. And then there's another one that deals with the south of France again, which is all about kind of contextualising the election of a far-right mayor in the town of Béziers, of course, a big rugby town as well, a big wine town as well, and about how we get to a stage where you can see a mayor who stands on a Front National ticket, now the Rassemblement National, of course, and gets elected, understanding some of those kind of political ambiguities about identity, about roots, about all the other things around it, and that kind of passage from left to right. I think that's a place where I think your comparison earlier on about the north of England and the south of England can really be useful in terms of understanding that.
Brilliant. And then one last fun one. Of course, a lot of our students are not students, listeners are either students or they tend to be a bit older in professional life or retired. If you had to recommend some wines for all three groups, what would you recommend?
Well, I'm always a big fan of Fitou, Fitou. That's a kind of appellation from the Aude. Fitou, Minervois, Corbière, some excellent appellations that I always find you can get some value in. I think it's a lot of people tend to shy away from buying French wine because there's always the sense that they can get kind of better value if they're buying New World stuff. But I think especially if you're kind of sampling the wines of the south, a Fitou, Minervois, Corbière, you'll find a lot more value for a big punchy red. Or again, if you want to drink white from the south of France, a Picpoul de Pinet. You'll get different brands in different places. There's they're not what you call it, they're not rare wines, shall we say? Yeah. But they are phenomenal in terms of a drink. So yeah, that's the appellations I tend to go: Fitou, Minervois, and Corbière, and maybe a little Picpoul de Pinet as well, if we're talking about it. But yeah.
Oh, brilliant. And thank you very much again for coming on today, Andrew. I've really appreciated it, and I've learnt so much more, so thank you very much.
Excellent. No problem at all. I'm happy to be here, and thank you very much, Jackson. Cheers.